Okay, it's again. Can we just get this out of the way? Right here? Okay. So, before speaking here tonight, I asked friends what they think about me speaking publicly. Importantly, I wondered what the repercussions would be on both me and my family. So I was eager to hear their unbiased advice. Some friends told me to go ahead and speak. One of them quoted the words from the Torah. There was no house in which no one was dead. Virtually every family, he told me, has a child who suffers from mental illness. So there's nothing to be ashamed of. Naturally, I took these words, among that of other friends, as a sign to indeed go ahead and proceed with this speech. Other friends, though, who care about me just as much, they told me not to speak publicly. They told me that my primary responsibility in life is to my children. They proceeded to warn me of the possible repercussions that may result. Yet this, too, I took as a sign to proceed with this speech, because it reminded me of the iron curtain behind which this illness hides and the unnecessary courage it takes to confront it. In fact, I do this for my children, because like all parents, I want my children to live in a world better than the one I inhabit, a world where all illnesses can be confronted and cured. So, I will not dive into the most significant details of my journey, since I know that it will be too much for my eyes to handle. Additionally, I do not want to infuse the short time allotted to me with so much suffering and pain. Instead, with the help of a few anecdotes, I want to tell you how this ordeal changed my view of OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. So, instincts and first impressions are hard to overcome. So, like he said, I'm currently in medical school. So just recently, I was viewing a PowerPoint for a biochemistry course featuring an image of an overweight child who suffered from leptin deficiency disease. The next slide featured the very same child after treatment with artificial leptin, upon which a healthy body weight was restored. So I looked back at the first slide and took notice of how fat and how large the child appeared to be. And I forget leptin deficiency, I thought to myself. The truth must be that this child eats too much. So this is what I thought. But if we are to live examined lives that are true to ourselves and to God, we must check our instincts despite them being correct most of the time. And I noticed this from my immunology course, where we learned about diseases where the immune system, which is truly one of the most amazing systems, when it goes awry and attacks the very body it was formed to protect. So thousands upon thousands of times a day, our immune system gets it right. And it coordinates an impossible and magnificent task. Yet, when it gets it wrong and refuses to acknowledge and amend its ways, complete disaster results. So, our gut psychological instincts are not unlike the instincts of our body. Life would be incredibly difficult without them. Yet occasionally, they too go awry and allow us to throw our entire weight behind a belief or thought that is false or unhelpful. It is our task then, just as it is the physician's task regarding the immune system, to interject and stop the erroneous instincts from metastasizing. So I hope then you will allow me to challenge your instincts, and you would trust me in what I ascribe to untreated mental illness. My goal is not to drag you down with me into the dark that I experience. Because if you trust me that it could be darker than you ever imagined, please also trust me that with the proper tools, it can be brighter than you ever imagined. I would certainly not be in medical school had I not been challenged by OCD. So I appreciate the difficulty herein because both extremes represent a challenge. Because some find it hard to accept the extent of pain involved in untreated mental illness, whereas others find it hard to accept the possibility of healing from mental illness, believing that once someone is condemned, he remains that way forever. And both of these beliefs, instincts if you will, are deep-rooted stereotypes that occasionally even I find it hard to overcome. So here, let me start with my first anecdote, my only anecdote. So when I was 14 years old and studying in a religious school, I was plagued by the thought that I believed conveyed sheer evil inherent in my soul. The thought had me wonder if God existed. Now, I wanted God to exist. I wanted to serve him, and I wanted Judaism to be the means that this is done. But I had no way of getting to this state. The more I tried to answer this question, to find clarity and move on, the more the question bothered me. Nothing in my life made sense anymore, because everything I was supposed to be doing was dependent on this fact, which was so rudely and abruptly yanked from beneath my feet. I had no idea who I could even turn to for help, because I was convinced that the existence of this doubt was the result of my evilness, an evil so great, the ultimate evil, that I would be a fool to share it with anyone. I could not understand how was it that everyone besides me was going about their day as if nothing happened and everything made sense, while I was stuck on this silly but most fundamental point. I wished I could bypass this question and restore my happy-go-lucky self. But I had no idea how to get to this point. So before I continue with this anecdote, I hope you can appreciate a few themes here. First, something that might be interpreted as a problem of a different orientation, in essence, can be an expression of OCD. Second, because OCD disguises itself in elements of everyday life, it is often hard for both the sufferer and the person who he may turn to for help to recognize it as a disorder external to the character of its host. Third, OCD can attack anything. I know we're often used to thinking about it in terms of germs, but that's not hardly the case. So long as its host deems it to be important, OCD can attack it. If a sufferer, I'm going to go really slow on this part because this I think is important. If a sufferer deems it important to not be preoccupied with bodily functions, for example, his OCD will attack just that, forcing him to be preoccupied with these bodily functions. The thought of these bodily functions would precipitate the corresponding function, forcing the sufferer to forever engage in that function. So examples include yawning, blinking, swallowing saliva, and breathing. So alternatively, the OCD of some male sufferers has them preoccupied with their ability to function as a biological male, in which case his preoccupation with success will without exception ensure complete failure. This then is the viciousness of OCD. The intrusive thought that precipitates this bodily function is entertained and prominently featured in the sufferer's mind precisely because he does not want to feature it, because he wants to forget it. The more the sufferer attempts to eradicate the thought, the more the thought comes roaring back. The sufferer, who was already overwhelmed by the thought, is forced to evict it once more, only to cause it to come back again, stronger and more powerful than before. Why stronger and more powerful? Because in his attempt to not think about the thought, he is thinking about it, albeit in alternative form. So even if by some miracle he forgets about the thought, which usually only occurs after frustration with life as a whole, his subconscious mind will notate the blissfulness, which feels so out of place for him. So his subconscious mind will notate the blissfulness he chanced upon and bask in the glory of the thought-free life. Finally, he's cured. Whereupon the thought would come roaring back. The sufferer remains convinced that there's a logical way to stop the thought, to rectify it, to answer it, to stop it from reoccurring once and for all. However, the OCD uses the same mind that found the answer to find a new question or to doubt the answer that was supplied, bringing back the thought and whatever the thought precipitated. So this is also very interesting. Most sufferers have one theme of OCD that trumps all others, making it impossible for them to entertain anything else in life, including other themes of OCD. So a sufferer whose OCD expresses itself in one form might not relate and certainly not experience other forms in which OCD can express itself, because he's so consumed with his theme of OCD. So back to my story about me and God. Because I was embarrassed to tell anyone about these thoughts, yet I was still so desperate for relief, I decided to turn to a younger brother because I wasn't embarrassed of him. He was only 7 at that time, but he seemed to have it all figured out. After all, he was living a happy life, which to me meant that he certainly had the answer to my questions. Otherwise, how could he possibly be happy? However, as expected, his answer did not satisfy me, leaving me once again searching not for a possible answer, but for a resource for which I could address the question to. So although this was more embarrassing, I finally turned to one of my older brothers. Thankfully, I have many brothers. He conveyed intellect and compassion, and he answered my most troubling thoughts, at least to the point that I somehow found it in me to forget and move on. However, this intrusive thought, in its alternative and changing versions, repeatedly resurfaced. Every time it resurfaced, it would pain me in the same manner that it pained me on its first day. But then again, I would somehow find it, I would somehow manage to just move on and forget the associated intrusion. So this worked until I was 16, when I found myself unable to control the forces of this question, which I believed to be rooted in logic, and hence more logic or better logic would provide an answer and relief. So I asked a rabbi at the institution I was studying in if I could talk to him privately, upon which he brought me into the staff conference room, a room that I never saw before this day, never saw after. I was so embarrassed with the content of my question, and this, by the way, applies to other themes of OCD. They're really, really embarrassing, even if it's just a bodily function. So I was so embarrassed with the content of my question that I could not open my mouth to talk. Yet, at the same time, I knew that I could not return to the hell I was living in. I felt tears coming down my cheek, which made me more embarrassed than I already was. In an attempt to relieve myself from this embarrassment, which was primarily from the words about to come out of my mouth, I asked him to shut the light. I was simply too embarrassed to be seen. And I still remember, this is when I was 16, I still remember his reluctance to follow through with my bizarre request. However, his compassion outweighed his inclination to avoid the awkward, upon which he proceeded to shut the light. I poured out my heart, disguised as a question, and ever so patiently, while repeatedly ignoring his ringing phone as our conversation dragged into the night, he answered them as best as he could. His care and compassion, coupled with the notion that all questions can now be directed to him for a prompt answer, quelled what I now came to view as my question machine and enabled me to continue. So I wrote down his every word on a few papers, that I kept close to me ever since. I would never go anywhere without the comfort of these papers. I didn't need a reminder to take these papers with me because I would not even think of going anywhere without the safety and protection of these papers. These papers, upon which the answer to my most burning and debilitating questions laid, would save me in the event that these questions would resurface and precipitate its associated unbearable pain. My fear was that if I would not take these papers with me, these questions would debilitate me to the point where I would not have the strength to go back and retrieve them, which meant just taking a bus, locking me into a most painful state. Hence, these papers became my life-saving companion. I took them with me wherever I went. Until I was 22 years old, I would not sleep under a roof that did not contain these papers. Now, I want to say this again. This struggle was a mere minor element in which my OCD manifested in. The prime theme of my OCD, which only showed up when I turned 20 years old, was so powerful and intrusive that it completely replaced the aforementioned struggle. I was so preoccupied with this new theme that I had nothing in me to entertain its first theme. However, I want to point out how this ordeal came to an end. After I already went through more than 6 months of cognitive behavioral therapy, coupled with exposure and response prevention, a thought crept into my head. My therapist never even told me. I don't think I ever discussed this with my therapist. I thought, what if I would get rid of these papers? What would happen if I were to thrust myself into a world lacking the protection of these papers? Do I have the strength to depart from the safety net that these papers cast? Do I have the strength to abandon the papers that so faithfully protected me? Do not assume that these papers turned my hell into paradise, one that was free from all doubts and questions. Do not assume that my worry and doubts were completely quelled by these papers, such that they restored the bliss I enjoyed before these thoughts entered my head. This equation was never fully satisfied. But despite the lack of complete bliss, my OCD mind was sure that the world would be a lot worse without them. So as I pondered this truly ambitious proposal, I made my way to the drawer underneath my bed, the drawer that I kept the few things that I deemed important. The papers were buried in between these items, both because they were the most precious of all, and because no one else was allowed to know of their existence. I took these papers and put them in my pocket. And then I took matches from the kitchen, and I headed to our roofless garage. There, I made a small fire. I inserted the papers, and I watched them go up into flames. An exhilarating thrill enveloped my soul, one that I could never explain or articulate. Perhaps to experience this level of thrill, one needs to first experience the same level of pain. All I did was get rid of some papers, but in doing so, I freed myself from a force that limited me, a force that made me small. This thrill was not one of doing the right thing. It was not one of pleasing external forces. It was a thrill of doing the wrong thing, of doing the opposite of what the external forces dictated. But precisely because it was wrong, precisely because it was in violation of what I felt was right, precisely because it destroyed my safety net, precisely because of this did I become free. My freedom was not because I satisfied a force, but because I thrust myself into a phenomenon where external forces did not even matter. So make no mistake, in undertaking this action, I felt that I am putting the rest of my life at risk. But it was in assuming this risk that I earned my freedom. Thank you. I was free, not because external conditions allowed me to be free. Rather, I was free because I chose to be free. I was so happy and thrilled that I was overcome with a sudden urge to dance, even though I always hated dancing. Even later at my wedding, I did not enjoy the dancing component. But on that night, I was desperate to dance. Yet I was afraid to dance because I was sure I would be committed had I been seen dancing alone to a fire on a random Thursday night. So it is said that a pain that is not shared is doubled, and a joy that is not shared is cut in half. I experienced the most unimaginable pain. And I want you to associate OCD with pain. It's not an illness of being weird. It's an illness of pain. Yet this pain was doubled because I could not share it with anyone. And then on that fateful night, and on many, many other occasions, I experienced the most unimaginable joy. Yet they were all cut in half because I could not share them with anyone. So this then is what I seek to accomplish here tonight, and thank you, Neshamos, for this. But the greatest possible joy that I am hereby attempting to derive is one that would allow me to find meaning in my past. And the only way that I could find meaning in my past is by preventing or reducing its occurrence in others. So this anecdote illustrates an interesting fact about OCD, and I imagine that this applies to other psychological conditions as well. Despite the good intentions and sincere compassion of everyone that I turned to for help, in attempting to help me and reduce my pain, they made my pain worse than it already was. They relied on their good instincts to answer my questions. They thought that this will reduce my pain. They certainly never anticipated that therapy for OCD dictates that these questions be made larger. Our natural instinct is to eliminate the source of pain, not to magnify it, which is exactly how OCD must be treated. I needed to expose myself to my fears, whether they were in the form of intrusive thoughts, whether they were in the form of germs, or in any form they manifested, not avoid them. So while my brother and the rabbi, many rabbis, all sought to relieve me from my suffering, they only made it worse by validating it. My question about the existence of God was not a question for which knowledge would serve as an answer. It was OCD, which needed treatment. Answers can relieve the pain of questions, but they cannot relieve the pain of OCD. By answering my question, they sent a message to my brain that this question is real and serious, one that is in need of an answer. But any answer they would supply would wither in the face of OCD, whereas the validation they unwillingly granted to my question remained firm, solidifying and strengthening the demon they thought to eradicate. Their answer served as compulsions, which by its very nature validates the associated obsessions. While compulsions provide momentary relief, they also validate and reinforce the obsessions. And in the long run, only the validation is what lasts. This now strengthened question seeks an even greater compulsion, an even greater answer, thereby exasperating this disorder. So without proper insight, there is no way that these rabbis would have the wisdom to magnify my troubling thought. This form of intrusive thoughts can occur in believers of all faith, including atheists, who may wonder if their way of life is correct, in the same manner that I wondered about mine. I cannot wrap my head around the fact that in my most dire moment of need, the help that I was provided by the kind and well-intentioned people, truly kind, made my pain worse. So while we may have good instincts, all people that I dealt with were thoroughly kind and had every intention to help me become better. We must ensure that the services we provide yield the result we seek. Only a trained professional specializing in OCD is qualified to treat OCD. Sometimes it's hard to imagine that some other person can know how to maneuver through life better than oneself. So regarding physical illnesses, we know and accept that we have no idea what is going on inside our body, and we submit to the superiority of the physician. But with regards to operating our day-to-day life, it is easy to assume that anyone who faces the circumstances that we face would act in the same way and derive the same conclusions we derive. How can some man or woman sitting in a different city who spends half his day listening to classical music know how to operate my life better than myself? I imagine that these trained professionals operate in the same way I would operate if a patient would one day come into my office and complain of abdominal pain. There's a simple algorithm that physicians would follow. They inspect, they auscultate, they percuss, they palpate, they conduct special tests. And all the patient knows is that his stomach hurts. But as physicians, we can follow this formula and diagnose the vast majority of the illnesses of the abdomen. And better yet, as physicians, we can treat the vast majority of the illnesses that we diagnose. Just as physicians can make sense and cure the illnesses of the abdomen, a therapist can make sense of the illnesses of the soul. However, unlike physical illnesses, it is the patient who must cure himself of the emotional illness. The patient must save himself by himself, using his own force, harnessing his own soul, and confronting his own demons. A therapist can only show the patient the way. However, the patient must do the work. Which is why I'm thoroughly offended by the notion that this experience is one best to be kept secret. After facing the most arduous of challenges, after fighting the most difficult of battles, the most serious of illnesses, after being the most courageous of men, why should I have to walk away in shame? I did not earn my freedom by having freedom bestowed on me. The therapist did not operate on my soul and heal my OCD, nor was this done in the form of a pill or ingested substance. I am free because I set myself free. I faced down my fears one by one. I followed them to the hell they brought me into, and I remained there, willing to confront anything and everything they had to offer. I went down the scariest of alleys, places that were dangerous only in my imagination, and places that were truly dangerous. It is because of this work that I am free, and it is of this work that I am most proud of. Thank you. The OCD is what happened to me, but it is... The OCD is what happened to me, but it is an external force, external to an eternal soul. OCD is not who I am. I am the person who confronted and still confronts OCD. I was so proud of my journey that when I was to write my personal statement for medical school, I decided to write about this experience. To be clear, I did not write this because I sought compassion from the admissions committee. Rather, because I was repeatedly advised to write about what you're most proud of, your greatest accomplishment. And I could not think of anything greater in my life than confronting my OCD. I was interviewed by a number of schools. Some of them required that I be interviewed a number of times by a number of people. Yet no one asked me about OCD until I came to one rather more prestigious school, whereupon I was asked, "So, Mendel, you say you have OCD. How do you think you would deal with the stress of medical school?" And of course, I was prepared for this question, and I promptly shared my ready-made response. I told her that before I started treatment, I could not handle any obligations. I recall telling my mother to make an appointment, not to make an appointment with a therapist, because even this obligation, quote obligation, was too daunting for me and would prevent me from sleeping the night prior. Yet I told the interviewer that now I am married, I have 3 children, I finished a degree in chemistry, starting from a GED. Further, I told her that medical school is challenging for everyone. Hence, having been successful in confronting my previous challenges, positions me to further confront the challenges of medical school. So after I told her my spiel, she looked at me and she said, "Mendel, I too have OCD." Upon which I looked at my folder, and once again I looked at her credentials, and I yelled out, perhaps in a voice too loud for the tiny room that we were in, "And you are a doctor, an emergency medicine specialist no less." So I just finished my first year of medical school. Which was certainly a most stressful and challenging experience for me and for all my classmates. Many of them said that this was their most challenging year of their entire lives. Yet, I have completed this year, and I have done well, without any qualifications or exceptions. No one in the school needed to know that I had OCD. I never asked for an excused absence or for a special arrangement of any kind, nor have I taken any medication. Yet, I have finished this year ranking toward the top of my classmates. But my goal is not to underscore how it is possible to be successful despite OCD, although this is certainly true. One of the smartest people I know has OCD, and one of the most financially successful people I know has OCD. Rather, my goal is to state and illustrate my firm belief that OCD forces its host to live a more meaningful life. You know, there's a cliche that states that it is a sign of courage to seek help, not a sign of weakness. Now, although this statement is certainly true, it fails to illustrate the entire story. Because wouldn't it be even better to not have to seek help and not have to be courageous? So it is to the cynic in me that I talk to. Because while I may have aspired for a simpler life, one that would not feature pain and not require healing, I am fully aware that this is an oversimplification. The behavior a OCD sufferer constantly engages in to reduce the tone of his fears disposes him to more easily harness courage, with which he can live a more meaningful life. More meaningful than had he not been confronted with this challenge. If one's boat rocks, he's required to become a more skillful sailor. Furthermore, being challenged with a rocky boat does not merely force its sailor to become more skillful, it forces its sailor to choose a direction where he wants to go. He wouldn't be doing all that work for nothing. Those who are lucky enough to be in a position where things are always smooth and the sun always shines face perhaps the greatest challenge of all. They are not compelled to choose a direction, or nothing compels them to choose one. Whereas he whose journey is subject to pain and challenge, he who at times is floating by the skin of his teeth, has repeatedly thought about the quest of his journey. People with OCD, by virtue of the challenges that face them, and by virtue of the strength necessary to harness against these challenges, are forced to live a more meaningful life, to make this journey worthwhile. And this is a great example. I once thought that you need to have exceptional skills to succeed in medical school. I quickly realized, though, that the only difference between people that are in medical school and those that are not is the curriculum the medical students are subject to. Because before I started medical school, I never thought that I could stay up an entire night and still do well on an exam. Then one night, before an exam, I noticed how I was totally unprepared. And I began studying as best as I could, hoping to finish as early as possible and get some sleep. However, time was just passing by with me still feeling not ready. So I continued studying throughout the night and until the morning. I did not actively stay up, and I certainly did not plan for it. The circumstances forced me to harness strength that I never thought I had. And I think I did well on that exam. We with OCD are repeatedly forced to harness an enormous magnitude of strength. Being repeatedly forced to harness this strength inevitably makes us more courageous, more empathetic than we would have been otherwise. Our character is shaped by this courage. We learned ever so vividly that our serenity would never be achieved by pleasing external forces. We have seen where pleasing these forces leads us, and we are determined never to follow this path again. Instead, we are positioned to follow our calling and do what is right, regardless of the challenges and in spite of the fear, of our fear. So it is for this reason I'm here tonight. 10 years ago, after repeatedly confronting my OCD, I became determined to share this story, because this is not my personal story, and nothing in this story is personal to me. Rather, in one form or another, it is the story of millions of Americans and thousands of Ashkenazic Jews. I thought about the time when my 70, 80 years would be finished, and I asked myself, and I would ask myself, what would I be most proud of? Would it be in successfully keeping some story a secret, or would it be in sharing it, thereby potentially helping others? Upon which I realized that the correct choice was crystal clear. I hope that sharing this would enable at least one person to seek treatment earlier. It is for him or her, for this one person, that this will all be worthwhile. Thank you.